So oral history. Now you now know a little bit about the history of this subfield of public history, why we do it, some of the theories and problems behind it, and some of the advantages behind it. Today, let's talk now about just simply how to do it. So again, one of the reasons I love oral history is that it does give everybody simply a chance to get their story told. And I did a lot of this when I was a grad student, dealing with people like Joe Duralmo here, who was a CCC enrollee. And so he's the kind of person whose history normally doesn't get told. This was at this is at Highlands Hammock State Park down in South Florida back in November of 2002. And he grew up poor in Florida. He was the son of a sharecropper. He barely went to school. They were on welfare. But because of his experiences with the CCC, I was able to find him and get his story down. So again, this is one of the reasons I love oral history, because it does give everybody a chance to get their story told. So what do you do? How does this work? So let's walk through it step by step. So first off, the pre-interview. So what do you do before you start doing this? I mean, obviously, you got to pick a topic or a theme. Sometimes you might find yourself part of a oral history program, or like now, I think for a lot of you, you're in a class. So a lot of times this is going to be chosen for you. But maybe you're an independent researcher or you're a grad student and you're kind of thinking about doing a new project. So again, and that new project you have chosen is within living memory, so there may actually be people around today for whom an oral history might be appropriate. So once you pick your theme or your topic, then you need to try to pick the best people to interview. Now sometimes, like in my case with the CCC, I mean this was 2002, I was talking 60 to 70 years earlier, pretty much anybody involved in the CCC, I was going to interview, at least if they were in Florida, which was my geographical area. But for some topics, like say 9/11 or the history of a college or a recent war, there because it does take a while to do this, you might want to be a little bit more selective in who you choose. And as we talked about the other day, you might want to make sure you're very representative. However it works out, really think about who you're going to interview, because that's going to be your main sources. Then you're going to need to conduct research. Now, you may do research first and then start picking people, but and again, you're always doing research. But when I say research, you're also researching that person and their experiences to a large degree. You're going to be looking at historiography, the wider context. Also, make sure you're not just simply duplicating something other people have done. I think I told you the other day that I interviewed somebody when I was a park ranger who turned out to have already had an interview. And in fact, they were almost identical, even though they were 30 years apart. So you want to look at historiography. What have people done before you? Where does your research fit in? But again, you're also going to be doing some research on the person you're interviewing as well. Not just about their life, but about their experience. The last thing you want to do, and I've seen this, is you don't want to do what I call the Larry King experience. I don't know if you know who Larry King is. He's still around. He's in his late 80s now, but he was a very famous interviewer. He was on CNN for about 30 years. He now has his own web show. And Larry King always brags that he doesn't do any research on anybody because I want to stay curious. And it makes for really bad interviews. I've seen so many interviews where he's interviewing them for an hour, but the first 20 minutes he's clearly just trying to figure out who he's interviewing, what they're about, and it's just a waste of everybody's time. So you don't want to interview somebody and then ask them really obvious questions that you really should already know. Like in my case, I'm not going to go, tell me what the CCC is. I mean, I can look that up in a book. Why am I asking this person? So again, you do want to do a lot of research, including on the person you're doing. Once you've sort of got some ideas of who you might want to interview and you've done some research, then you want to, obviously contact them. Now, sometimes it might be a phone call and stuff, but if you're dealing with older people, and you do want it to be official, even if you may call them first, you still would like to send a letter, or, and there are still older citizens around that kind of prefer a letter. If not a letter, then maybe an email. And one reason I'm kind of picky about this is so that there is a record of the conversation, because that's one thing. You're going to preserve all the communications you're going to preserve. And I would, even on the phone conversation or even a face-to-face conversation, I would just jot a little note down to myself on August 18th, I talked to so-and-so about doing an interview. Just because there's sort of a running tab on what you're doing. Then I would do some sort of pre-interview. Now, for those of you in the public history class that I visited the other day, I tried to give everybody a copy of one of these. But I have a little survey that I have a general one that I use sometimes, and then for specific projects, I will make up my own. And it will be their name, their birth date, where they're from, where they live, where they went to school, all that really basic info, the kind of stuff you might see on a baseball card for a player, or kind of a Wikipedia kind of entry, right? Born, married, all that. So that I have some idea, even before I talk to them, about who they are. This is also a good way, once you pick a topic, maybe to try to find people. Sometimes you could go to a historical society and say, hey, can you give this survey out to people? And then give them back to me. And sometimes a survey is a good little way to kind of get some, to go, oh, these would be good people. So again, all these steps can kind of happen interchangeably. It's not you have to do 1, 2, or 3. You might do some of these all at the same time. But this gives you some sense of what to do research on, what questions to ask, what questions not to bother to ask. So you're not fishing the whole time. You're not constantly going, so were you in the Navy? No, darn. Were you in the Army? Nope, darn. Were you, That's also insulting to the person. And for instance, I'm not a military person, so I've done a lot of World War II interviews. So by using a pre-interviewer survey, and sometimes a pre-interview means you just literally call them up or go see them and literally just talk to them for a moment and take notes. But sometimes a survey is better. And so if they said they were in the Navy and this was their rank and this was the battle they were in, I will go do research and all of that. So I'm not going to ask some obvious questions, nor am I going to look like very ignorant. And again, that can be very insulting. I've seen interviews or read interviews where it's very obvious that the interviewer doesn't know anything about the interviewee, and you can see the interviewee just kind of starts turning off. They're like, oh, you don't really know what I'm talking about, so why am I bothering doing this? And so a lot of this is just simply, if you will, a sign of respect. Now that once you've got your topic, you've done your research, you've picked your person, they've agreed to it, you've done a little bit more research on them, now you really need to set up a good time and a good place. And again, there's no hard and fast rules about this. I would argue that for older people, earlier in the day is probably better than late in the evening. They tend to get tired. I mean, again, to be stereotypical, but if you're talking about somebody who's over the age of 70, again, earlier in the day may be better. I tend to stay away from too early in the morning, but also too late in the evening. But 9, 10 o'clock in the morning is a great time. But it's up to them, obviously. And when I say a good place, I mean something that is a good place for them so they feel comfortable, but also a good place for the recording. You don't want it to be in a super loud place. You don't want it to be in the middle of a coffee shop or be outside on a front porch with cars driving by and wind blowing in your microphone and all of that stuff. You really do want to be thinking about, is this going to record well? One thing I probably won't get a chance to say this later, so let me be very clear here. Sometimes I do this as an assignment for my intro level classes, just like a shorter interview. And a lot of times I'm dealing with students that might be 17, 18 years old. They might be interviewing somebody who's, 50 or something. Make sure it's also good for you as well. I mean, your own personal space, not to get too creepy, but if you're a young female interviewing a male who's maybe 30 years older than you, and they say, yeah, come by my apartment about 10 o'clock tonight. It'll just be you and me, So make sure you're comfortable as well. But as much as you can, try to bend over backwards for the person more than about you. But again, don't forget, you need to be comfortable as well. Finally, for the person that you're interviewing, be very clear on what you're trying to do. And what's the goals of the interview? Like in my case, with the person I showed you at the beginning, I would be like, I'm going to interview you about your time in the CCC. I'm still going to interview them, about all their lives, but that's going to be the focus. That's my interest. And I would tell them my goal in this case is I'm writing a larger research project on this, and this interview is now going to be kept I think in this case it was kept at FSU's oral history programs. So they also know like what's going to happen with this. Because a lot of people will say, yeah, I'll do it. But then they're thinking, so why are you using this? What's the purpose of this? So just be very clear and upfront with them. That also gives them a chance to back out if they don't really like what you're doing. If they're not comfortable with that. They may go, oh, other people are going to see this? Oh, I don't want other people to see this. So in that case, it's probably the ethical thing to go ahead and just back out and say, thank you, but sorry, but this is, we are doing this for history. So once you've tried to, you've done all of this and you set up a good place, and I'll get a little bit more into the realities of recording an interview, then you want to do the interview itself. And again, there is no hard and fast rules about interviews. Again, it's always dependent on the person and the topic and the theme. But just a couple of things to keep in mind. Even if you're going to talk about something very specific, say the history of ABAC, you still want to get at least some sense of that person's life story. You want to be able to put that experience into a context. You don't want it to only be about that history, because then later researchers are like, well, who is this person? So when I am interviewing somebody, and here's an image of me, again, back in the early 2000s, interviewing a former CCC enrollee. And that's what they were called. Enrollees was the term for people who enrolled in the CCC. In this particular case, I look bored, but actually I'm really listening to the person. That's what I'm really trying to indicate, that I'm really paying attention to you. But from afar, it looks like I'm just, so make sure you do look interested when you're in. But in this case, almost all of these guys had interesting lives, growing up. And they talked about growing up in Florida during the 1920s and then the Great Depression and what their lives are like. I want to capture all of that, because that feeds into their story of why they went into the CCC. And most of them, because they were, teens in the 30s, most of the ones I interviewed, at least the ones that were still alive, because most of these guys would have went into the CCC in the late 30s. Almost all of them went into World War II. And even though that wasn't my focus, that's a whole nother interview. That's a huge topic. I made sure I asked about it and captured at least part of that story, because more than likely, no one else is ever going to interview them. And as far as I know, no one else has ever interviewed any of these. And I think almost all of these gentlemen have died, unfortunately. So their story, this is it. This is their story. And then I do try to take their story all the way up, even if it's very briefly, up till today. So there is some context. And again, and so context is everything. So in some cases, you are capturing their life story. That is your goal. But in other cases, when you're talking about something specific, you still want to be able to capture that and get some sense of context there. And as I said many times, one of the reasons I like doing this so much is because theoretically, at least anybody can do it. And I don't mean that to be flippant. I know Dr. Medley is very specific. We've talked about this, and I agree with her. You do need to be properly trained and know what you're doing. You don't want just anybody, literally anybody, doing it. And so I would not recommend a little kid doing this, like in this image. But I would rather a little kid do it than nobody ever do it, because at least their stories are being captured to some degree. But again, anybody, really meaning anybody can be interviewed. Everybody has a story. They always say all politics is local, all history is local. And all history starts with one person, one story. And then you get somebody else's story, then somebody else's. And eventually you get what we call history today. And of course, history is simply what is left over from the past. That's why my definition is the recorded past. So if nobody does, for instance, this, actually recording somebody, then, and by the way, that's the reason I have an image of me up here. This is from about 9 years ago. This was the first interview that we did at the college. A couple of students and I did the first interview. And so we were showing off the tape that we recorded. Like, yes, we finally started doing this. But if nobody does that and there is no recording, then that history isn't kept. So that's what we mean. We have to go out there and capture these. And so anybody theoretically can do this. Everybody's got a story. And that's why I get very excited about doing oral history. All right, let's talk about the interview itself. So make sure that you've walked in the door knowing what you're going to talk about. Ideally, you have some sense of what their answers are going to be. Not everything, but you should have some idea of where the interview is going to go. If it's all a surprise to you, if everything is something you weren't expecting, then you probably didn't actually do, you probably didn't do the right amount of research, or you didn't research well. So make sure you have your notes in front of you. Now, what I do is I always have them in front of me, but at the same time, I'm rarely looking at them. Now, let me kind of bring up, there's a whole bunch of stuff here. I may not go in order as they're written here. So one thing I tend to do is I have a little bit of a conversation before we start. I think it eases my nerves, but it also eases the nerves of the people you're talking to. Because most of these people have never done this before. And they're not used to this. And this is awkward to them. And they're very aware that you have something that you're recording their voice with. And you have these notes. And, so having a conversation is always nice anyway, But I always tell them again what I'm doing. And one thing I warn them is that I'm not always going to be looking at them. I try, but a lot of times I'm going to look down at my notes and see where we're at. My goal is to ask as few questions as I can. What you don't want is question, short answer, question, short answer. What we're really talking about, and I'm going to use kind of a term that's not usually used in history. What we sort of want is what's called a narrative stage. A lot of times you might go to a folk festival or some kind of demonstration, and there'll be somebody sitting on a stage and they're demonstrating something, or they're telling a story, and there may be somebody beside them that's just kind of prodding them a little bit. Hey, tell me about that. Tell me about this. But your ultimate goal is just to get the person talking. We want their story. We're not here for our clever questions or our opinions. Our questions are just to prod them along. That's really why we're there. And ideally, we ask one question and they talk for 40 minutes. And tell us everything we want to know. That doesn't usually happen. But if I have prepared them enough and told them what I'm interested in, and maybe even kind of give them a sense of what I'm going to ask them, a lot of the times they will cover much of what I want in their first answer. And I find that usually the first answer is like 20 minutes long. They kind of tell you their whole story, and then you kind of, when they're done, you kind of go back and fill in the blanks. So what I do as they're talking, I look down at my notes, and sometimes I just kind of go, oh, they asked that. They answered that. Oh, I don't need to ask that. But I'm making sure I'm paying attention to them. So again, there is a connection there. But I warn them that I am going to be looking down. Because again, when we're talking, if you just start looking around, the person talking to you is like, hey, come on, right here, right? What people will do is go, oh, you're looking over there? Okay, I'll just quit talking because you're not paying attention. I'm done. So I warn them that I may not look at them. I also warn them that I'm going to try my best not to go, oh, no, yeah, oh. I know it sounds ridiculous, but we do that all the time when we're, yep, yeah, oh yeah. The reason I say that is a couple reasons. You're going to be over talking them. So when you transcribe it, you're not going to hear, you're not going to be able to hear them because all you can do is hear yourself, and that's it. You can't transcribe it right. And then two, the people using this as research, they're getting a lot of yep, you got that, instead of the person. So you gotta respond. This is a human thing, and that's one thing that makes oral history very different from most of history, where we're sitting by ourselves in a library, no one around. This is interaction. So we have to connect, but we want to do it in a way that's as quiet and as non-invasive as possible. So I tell them I'm going to do a lot of this, but I'm going to try not to make as much noise as I can. And I'm going to try my best not to interrupt them. So sometimes I might go, to them, I might interrupt them quietly so it gives them a chance to sort of come to a stopping point. But I'm going to try my best not to step in too much. It's hard to do that. But I promise you, if you follow certain steps, you will be so thankful because once you start transcribing it, that's when you realize all the things you should have done. Usually, I know because of COVID, we couldn't do this. Usually when we have time and we don't have to worry about COVID, I usually have students interview each other for 5 minutes and then go off and go home and transcribe it and then bring it back. And that's usually when they go, yeah, I didn't think about it, but the air conditioning made a lot of noise, or the car outside made a lot of noise, or I made a lot of noise, or I didn't have the microphone where I needed it to be. So these are just some of the things you need to be thinking about. Getting back to the questions though, have your questions and research ready to go. Hopefully you've read over them enough that you don't have to just constantly look at them. You can just kind of glance down. Again, hopefully you know enough about it that you can just sort of, just glance and know what you're saying. And don't be afraid to go off script. I think I said this in class. Too often people go, why did you go into the Marines? Did you like it? And then the person might get this brilliant answer and talk about how their dad died and that's why they went in the Marines. You're like, was it hard? You obviously want to be listening so that sometimes you can take what they said and go in another direction with it. You might go, oh, I hadn't even thought of that. What I tend to do, and I think I have in the packet you got, I think I have some of the questions that I use. And not that they're great questions, but I think you can see some of my handwritten notes. And sometimes they may say something and I'll note, come back to that. I'll just write it down. Or they may say a name and I'll write it down. So I remember at the end to ask them how to spell that name, for instance. But the questions themselves, try to avoid yes/no questions. Those really bring very little to the table. In fact, most of the answers to those you should already know. Now, again, there's often times where you do need to do that. Again, it's not that you can't ever do it, especially if you're going into a new direction. But you want to keep those to a minimum. Because think about it. If you're interviewing me and I'm interviewing you and all we're doing is going, yep, we're in the Marines? Yes. Did you like it? No. Would you go back? No. That's not bringing much to the table. So think about open-ended questions. And this is something, by the way, we professors think a lot about when we're creating questions for a test. I have to be careful. Sometimes if I write a short answer question, if I don't word it right, the student will write one word, and I'll look at it and go, you know what, actually, the way I worded the question, that is, So you want to do things like, describe for me, blah, 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 blah. Tell me all about blah, blah. Like, okay, let me give an example. So I might say, describe for me what it was like actually, let me, sorry, I kind of blanked out for a minute there. I like first questions. Those are really good. So I might often say, tell me about that first day when you joined the Marines. Or describe for me that first class you ever taught. And so people don't always remember every day, obviously. If you ask me what it was like 3 years ago to teach, I'm not going to remember. It all runs together. But if you ask me to describe the first day I ever taught, I'm going to remember that. And as I'm describing that, that's going to trigger other memories. And I'm going to, so that's the other thing. We're trying to trigger those memories. So first day, your first time. Or another great one is to often say, describe for me a typical day as a professor, or describe for me a typical day in the CCC. That way they're not limited to one day. They can describe, sometimes we would get up at 6, sometimes we get up at 8, sometimes, they could kind of encapsulate an entire experience into a prototypical one day. So those are really good ways to get a lot of details that isn't just a yes/no answer. But you're not going, on July 8th, where were you? I always think when I watch a crime movie that if I ever get accused of murder, I'm in big trouble. Because whenever they say, where were you 2 Saturdays ago? I'm like, I don't know. I don't remember. So think about that. And again, if people are clearly having memory problems, you want to wait a little bit. This is a tricky one. You ask you a question, if there's a pause, you do want to wait a little bit, but too long, then they start getting embarrassed that they can't remember. So don't be afraid sometimes to go, okay, well, that's okay, but, and kind of ease into the question sometimes and try to find ways to finesse that a little bit, especially if they clearly are having problems. And sometimes people will try too hard to, we had this guy, and his name was Tom, no, it was Tim, and then they get all flustered, and you can say, well, it's okay, we don't need the name, just tell me in general what's going on. Of course, equipment. Make sure you have, this should be before the interview begins. Make sure that, and later I have a photo of showing this a little bit, But when I started, it was still audio cassette tapes, and you had to plug it in. I wanted backup batteries. I usually always had two things I was recording with. Nowadays, we're probably, like I'm doing right now, we're probably going to use our phone, but we might also have a laptop because you can record off your laptop as well. That wouldn't be a bad idea. I would have a personal, in fact, I meant to have it in my hand. You know what they look like, but a personal battery. That you can plug your phone into so that you don't have to worry about running out of battery halfway through, or plug it into the wall or something like that. I always bring plenty of pens and paper to write with. The last thing you want to do is have to ask them or try to remember everything. Because again, you're going to be talking before and after the interview as well, and you may need to write some stuff down. Bring a camera, a still camera. Again, with smartphones, everything's in one. But I do like photos of people, and I'm going to show you a couple more of people I've interviewed. Always test the equipment before starting. That doesn't mean, before you leave your house. That's good. But make sure even on the spot you double check. I have done an interview, luckily only one, where I did the entire interview. I got home and it didn't work. I don't think I ever had the heart to tell the person it didn't work. I just, they asked me, I said, yeah, that was a wonderful conversation with you. Because sometimes you can go back and re-interview, but sometimes that's all you got. You got one shot at it, and that was the case in this. I had one shot at it. I always record a lead. Sometimes I do this in my car before I get in there, where I have a preset where it would be something like, this is David Nelson. I am in Withlacoochee, Florida. It is August 12th, 2005, and I'm going to be interviewing today Mr. blah, 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 right? So that anybody that picks up that tape can or digital recording, and they know exactly what it was. Now, usually when I interview the person, when we start the interview, I'll do the same thing maybe again, but I do like that little lead, and this is also a nice way to check your equipment too. It's kind of a good excuse, so you're not just going testing, you're actually saying something. Okay, so once you actually start to do the interview, before we start, one thing I tend to do right before I hit record is I almost always tell them what the first question will be. Usually it's something along the lines of, tell me where you were born and a little bit about growing up, or tell me a little bit about your family. And I tell them I'm going to ask that, so they're not going, what are you going to ask me? Because that's always nervous when you first start. So sometimes you need that little okay, I know what he's going to say to me before we get started. And then once you get started, they almost forget that the recorder is on. And that's really kind of what you want. But you do want to also give them a sense that, you're going to go an hour or an hour and a half. I find 90 minutes is about long enough. It's kind of like students in a classroom. Once you hit about an hour and 15 minutes, you're ready to go. So if you're going to do a long interview with somebody, definitely break it up. And sometimes you might want to do it over several days, depending on how much access you have to them. Sometimes you got one shot, so you got to put it all in. But even then, you want to build in breaks. But I find an hour to hour and a half is kind of enough. You need a break. You need to go get lunch or something, then come back if you need to. Most interviews are about an hour, and that's usually all we get. So they know that. I also keep a clock near me, a watch, or on my phone, so I have an idea how long we're going. When you have tape, that you really had to think about that, because you had to make sure you weren't running out of tape, so you could flip the tape over. Today, that's not as big of an issue, luckily. But also the person can kind of, sometimes they can be thinking about that too, so they can make sure they're not going off on too many tangents. Now I have in here guide but don't push. This gets really hard because it is a conversation, but it's sort of a one-sided conversation. You're really wanting them to talk. But they're not used to doing this, most of these people. Now, sometimes you get a person that loves to tell a story, and that can be a problem too. So you do need to guide them, maybe occasionally kind of push them back on topic, and that's why, again, it's really important that they know what you want from them. So, and a lot of times they'll start talking and then they'll just say, is this what you want? And even if it isn't, try to always be positive. Don't go, no, that's not what I want, Be like, well, actually, yes, but maybe we could talk a little bit, So I think especially being Southern, I think most people who are probably watching this are probably ABAC students. Most of you are probably from the South. Most of you are probably going to be young. You're going to be talking to somebody older. If you're, talking to somebody of a different gender, that can get a lot of, I mean, we're the yes ma'am and yes sir, generations, right? We're Southerners, right? So we're not used to older people going, no, talk about this, not that. But yet we have to do that a little bit, very gently and politely. We do have to kind of guide them. And they want that, because they want to please. And that's why it also gets really hard, trying not to overreact. You want to react like if they tell something funny, laugh a little bit. But don't overdo it, because what people do is they start performing, and we want them to be real. We don't want them to perform, and people do like to please, especially if they're nervous. So if they make you laugh, they're going to keep making you laugh. So that gets a little bit funny. As far as places to record, I think there's a good chance to talk about this again. Again, be a Nazi about this, about sounds. Fans going off, air conditionings, cars outside, but also audience. We don't want an audience. Sometimes you don't have a choice, but we don't want the grandkids and the husband or wife, and ideally we want to be by ourselves. And there can be people in the house, but we want to be by ourselves. That's not always possible, but the reason it is because what happens is they either start performing for the people listening, whether they know it or not. Think about it. You're having a conversation with a friend, somebody else walks up. Even before they're talking, you're aware that they're there. And you kind of start changing what you're saying because you know someone else is listening, right? The other thing is sometimes people clam up because they start telling you something and then they realize, my wife or my husband is, they're going to correct me on that. Or they do. They step in and say, no, that wasn't right. Don't you remember? And it's a different interview. Sometimes you have to do it. Sometimes there's no choice, but try to keep that from happening if you can. And again, this gets a little bit more into, we talked about the other day, some of those interpersonal issues. You're a female. I mean, you're always going to get slightly different answers depending on who you are. So to be stereotypical, if you're an 18-year-old female, and maybe you know everything about the military, like for instance, I know very little about military. So I don't fit the male stereotype, right? But if you're an 18-year-old female interviewing an 80-year-old male, you're going to probably get a very different interview than if you were a 30-year-old male. It's not your fault. It's the person talking to you. Because for a female, they may go, I'm not going to get into the blood and guts. I'm going to talk more about my feelings, which is great. But to a male, they may not talk about the feelings, which that's terrible, but they'll talk about the other stuff, so there's always, just kind of keep that in mind. And things like race, if you're a young white male from the South, you're interviewing an African American about Jim Crow, that's going to change the nature of the interview. Anyway, I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Oh, the last thing on there is listen. Always listen. In the end, it's all about listening. So again, you can see here, this is going back to the early 2000s. And even though he's talking, I am looking down because I am jotting notes while he's talking. But I have warned him. In fact, this is one of the best interviews I've ever done. I use clips from this interview all the time in the classroom. But if you look, this is again early 2000s. You can see a close-up here. You can see I got the mic and I got it on a styrofoam so it won't make a lot of noise. We're inside. It's just us. My wife did come in to take the photo, but that's it. She left after she took a couple of photos. You can see I got backup tapes there. I got 2 recorders there. So I was prepared. So make sure you're prepared as well. Again, we talked a little bit about this already in the classroom, but going back, keep in mind some of the ethics. Again, make sure you explain to them about copyright, that you both have the copyright. In fact, they own the copyright until they sign it over, but even then, they're still sharing it. Make sure that you kind of protect them a little bit from admitting things like affairs they may have. And it's amazing what people will admit to in an interview. They may talk about, prejudices that they've had and stuff. And it's not that you want to stop them completely, but just sometimes remind them that they're being recorded occasionally. And again, that definitely when it gets into legal issues, like if they're admitting to a crime, which hopefully won't happen much, but you might want to. I tell you what happened a lot with us at FSU was interviewing World War II vets, and they would talk about stuff that really was war crimes. They would talk about, I remember, the war was over with, but there were still Japanese soldiers in the woods, so we should just go kill them. Like, that's a war crime, what you just admitted to. So we wouldn't say it quite like that, but we might sometimes go, are you sure you want this on tape? Those kinds of things. So in other words, you want to protect your source is what we're talking about. You know, you're not here to get people in trouble or anything, or or what's more likely is for them to admit stuff that they're going to regret later. And one way we get around this sometimes is that some people will record the interview and all that, but they say, I don't want anybody to see this until I pass away. So sometimes you can have time frames, like the release form can say, you know, this will not be released until the year 2030 or something like that. I mean, you don't want it to be ridiculous, like 500 years later, but if it's if that's a matter of not having an interview or having an interview, it's always better to have it with some kind of stipulation. And one thing, don't argue with them. Even sometimes they are wrong. I mean, it's definitely not details, and they'll get a date wrong and stuff. They can fix that later. But definitely don't criticize. I mean, it is their memory. And they are going to talk about stuff that you politically or racially or emotionally don't agree with, but it's their story. It's not your story. You know, you can do that when you write up your book. But even then, when I've done it, I've tried to be very careful because, again, I am extremely appreciative that these people have done this. And as I keep saying, gentle prodding is okay. If they don't want to talk about something, you might gently say, you sure? Or maybe even come back to it a little bit later. Sometimes at the beginning they don't want to talk about something, but later they will. But again, if they say no, this is not a news program. Again, they have the power, if you will. So I've talked about some of this already. Just keep in mind things like race, age, gender, sexual orientation, political orientation. And hopefully you kind of have a sense of that even before you sit down. I try to give a way of myself as I can. I want to be somewhat of a blank slate. I might have even been guilty, maybe giving a slightly false impression so they feel comfortable. I won't ever say anything that's untrue, but I may not I may not give my politics away or my religion away or anything like that, because that might shade how they are going to respond. Again, sensitive topics to think about, especially when it comes to things like race and sex and gender and orientation and stuff. Or I'll give you a good example. One of the guys I interviewed, I don't think I have his photo in this PowerPoint, but one of the people I interviewed that was in the CCC grew up very poor. And especially people of that generation did not like to talk about being poor. They were embarrassed by it. And I remember he was describing where they went to the bathroom. They lived in literally a shack. And they didn't even have an outhouse. They would go outside and literally go in what they called a relief spot. And as he was telling this, he was saying it like he said, I had a friend that you can just kind of tell that he was trying to say it a certain way. He said, I had a friend that didn't even, but he kept slipping and saying me and we. And it was really obvious it was about him. I never said that. I never went, is this really about you? But it was obvious it was. But it was a sensitive topic for him. And everyone's different. And so always be aware of yourself, who you are, your race, your gender, all that, how that reflects on just there's not much you can do about it. Just be aware of it and try to be as sensitive as you can. Try to dress appropriately. I think I look okay, but if my shirt's untucked, it depends on who I'm interviewing. I might dress up a little bit more for older people. Again, show respect by how you present yourself. As I said, no audience. And one thing you guys might be surprised at is, let me go one slide ahead here, and I'm going to come back. Don't do this. I'm videotaping right now, and believe me, I'm very aware that this camera is staring right at me. I'm very self-conscious right now. In fact, if I turned around, you would see how sweaty my back is, because I get very nervous in front of a camera. If I'm in front of a classroom, I couldn't care less, but in front of a camera, that gets me. It's like, it literally is somebody just staring at you. People are very different when there's a camera versus a recorder. They forget about the recorder. They don't forget about that camera. And so they're always looking over at it. So I find that to do an interview, always do it audibly, right? Now, sometimes you want a video for a documentary, for a museum exhibit. What you do in that case is you do the interview, you get the stories you really want, you go back to the person and say, can you tell that story again? Or can you tell this story again? And then you can actually, I don't know if you've ever been involved in a documentary, it's more like making a movie. They refilm it, they tell you, can you look this way? Can you look, there is a phoniness to documentaries that I think a lot of people don't realize. We don't want to be phony. We want to be as real as we can. So the interview should be audio only, and then if you need to, go back and film it. If you're doing a documentary or something, because you have the authentic recording already. And even a recording is not completely authentic, because even they're performing, but that's about as good as we're going to get. So let me go back to the previous slide. So no videoing, and I know everyone groans when I say that. Oh, that's the cool part, but really, I promise you, it's much better. I think I've said most of this. React silently if possible. Check for sound interference. And I'm telling you, when you transcribe it, every little sound you're going to hear. Whether it's the phone or a microphone, keep it as close to them as you can. You know what you say, but you don't know what they're going to say. So when you go back to transcribe it, you know what you said. So that's easier. Plus, I tend to talk a little bit louder, because I know the mic's far further away from me, but I want them not to be thinking of the mic. And don't let them touch your equipment. Because they love to do that. A lot of times they'll grab the mic and go, is this good? Is this good? So I always say, no, don't touch it, don't touch it. Let me set it where I want it. Make sure they're comfortable, but at the same time, try not to have any food around. Drinks are okay, but try not to have any food around, any crinkling. Don't let them have notepads in front of them, because they're going to start reading. Anyway. Okay. I've already said this. Give away the first question as well. Okay, so we've seen the camera already. Copyright, I know I've talked about this. I just want to reemphasize it. Whether they sign the release form or not, they always have copyright to their story. You're only sharing it. But of course, if you do not get that copyright signed, that release form signed, ethically, you really aren't supposed to use the interview. Now, I always have them say it on tape. I know I'm old. I always say tape. I can't say otherwise. But I always have them on the recording say, yes, I agree to this. I'm fine. I start with that and I end with that. We were recording, right? And I want them to audibly say yes. And I say, and you were okay with that, right? Okay, thank you. And I always make sure I thank them very much on tape and in person after we're done recording. We're going to share it. But they always maintain, and I make sure they're clear. That also, by the way, makes them feel a lot more relaxed, because they're always going to be a little suspicious. What are you doing with this? But if you really emphasize, look, this is for you too, that they feel a lot better. And it really does help once you've done a few. You can show them transcripts of previous ones. Those first couple are the hardest ones, because no one knows who you are. But once you've done a couple, then they tell their friends, and that helps a lot as well. After the interview, immediately after, by the way, again, whether it lasts 30 minutes or an hour and a half, always prepare for another hour. Always prepare for another hour. Once people get talking, and I know this as a teacher, when I walk out of the classroom, I'm talking a mile a minute. My wife is always getting on to me. Honey, you're not in class anymore. Because you're kind of revved up, right? It's like if you ever performed in theater, when you get done, you're just so much energy, right? They're the same way, and they're always telling you stories that you wish they'd done it on tape. Sometimes I have gone, hold on a minute, and I'll turn the tape recorder back on and say, hey, we're back. Can you tell me that again? Most of the time, you can't do that. It's not bad to take notes sometimes, but just kind of be aware, because you can't just go, thank you, I'm out of here. That's incredibly rude. They just told you all this personal stuff, and you're just going to run. So I'm very much an introvert. I'm ready to run. But if they offer you coffee, to be honest with you, take it. You don't have to eat dinner with them. I've done that many, many times. But sometimes they're trying to give you something, and they want to talk to you. And they're kind of like, we just had this experience. We want to, and again, you don't want to be wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, basically. So just kind of always prepare. Give yourself an out maybe at the beginning. Like, okay, when we get done, I do have to be work at 2. Don't do it at the end, because they are going to feel funny. They're going to, and I've had calls, I told you about, I don't know if I should have told you that. And also be prepared for a little bit of remorse like that. Okay, anyway, so the official post-interview, make sure you thank them in person. Give them a thank you note. Your mom and your grandma and all of them were right. It's nice to write thank you notes. Emails, maybe today, but a real thank you note, I promise you. Students give me those sometimes, and I hate to admit, they're nice. They're nice to have, and especially when someone's done something as personal as give you their life story. Then you transcribe it. And I'm going to talk about transcriptions in a moment. You're going to actually write up the interview. That's the hard part, by the way. The interview is easy. Then the interviewee is going to read it. Not everybody does this, and sometimes you just don't have a chance to do that. You really don't, but you really should. They should be able to read it and approve it. There should really be two releases. There should be the audio recording release and the transcript release. Because once they see the transcript, they may not agree to it after that, and they should have that right. One thing I warned them about is that when you transcribe written speech, it is completely different than, say, something in a novel. You ever read a novel out loud, it doesn't read like the way people really speak. But yet the way we really speak on paper looks really weird. I won't say it this way to them, but they're going to sound dumb. I mean, because if you think about speech, it's so much of it is incomplete sentences. I mean, a lot of our conversations is, oh, you got that right, yep. And on paper, it seems like, what are they saying? But in person, it made total sense because we're gesturing, we're making facial expressions, we're making other sounds other than words. So the transcript always sounds odd, and I warned them about that. But even then, people want to correct their grammar. I think I have an example that I gave you guys. I think I have it a little bit later in the slide, and you'll see where the person's even correcting their grammar. So you're going to send a copy to them, let them read it, correct anything like a wrong date or a wrong name. And then once you make those corrections, you send them a full copy and a copy of all the releases. That helps them and helps you. And then, of course, you're going to preserve and archive them in the end. So let's talk a little bit more about that transcription, because this really is the core of what we're doing. It's not the recording, although we save that. Very rarely do people ever listen to the recording, because if you're doing research and you're looking at 50 interviews, you do not have time to listen to 50 to 300 hours. You're going to quickly read the transcript and get the bits you want. So this is really the key part of it. This is, of anything, this is what it is. The recording sort of is the authenticity, and always keep that in mind with transcripts, that people can always go back to the recording, but the transcript really is it. It needs to be typed, obviously. It should have a header with all the relevant information. The interviewer, the interviewee, the date, the location, who's transcribing it. I like to transcribe my own, but it is time consuming. And if I get the program at ABAC underway, I'll be honest with you, we're going to hire some transcribers. But it is nice that you can be your own transcriber. But whoever's transcribing it, that should be listed on there. The dates of the transcription, and that's usually going to be several days. It won't usually just be one day. And then if there's a project name, CCC project or something like that. Here is a copy of a transcription. This is, you can see this is a long time ago now. A guy named George LaCourse, and he's the one I showed you the photograph earlier where we're at the table. And again, I transcribed my own here, but you can see towards the bottom that he actually kind of corrected some stuff. And he's even correcting his grammar. This gets a little bit tricky. They are allowed to go in and do that. I mean, we always have the recording, right? But we do want the transcription to be accurate, and we want them to be comfortable with it. Sometimes they'll scratch out info they don't want. How much is okay? That's tough. A little bit is fine. If they're going too much, then it's not the interview anymore. And now it's becoming more of a written document than a transcription. So there are times where you might have to say, look, if we're going to change everything, then either let's do the interview again or let's not call this an interview anymore. It does get tricky. Most people don't do a lot of this, but and this is why people don't always want them to see it. I did an interview one time, and I think I mentioned this at Wakulla Springs with the secretary. Oh my gosh, she got the best stories. But when she read it, she was very self-conscious already about how she spoke and all that. When she read it, she says, I sound like an idiot. I'm not signing this. And she didn't sign it. I have the interview, but I've never been ever able to let anybody see it. And she's now passed on. That's it. She never signed off on it. I could be really mean and say, well, on tape you said you did, but she did directly look me in the eye and said, I'm not signing this. I'm so sorry, but I'm not doing it. I can't use it now. And it's one of the best interviews I ever did. So it does happen. I mean, that's the chance we're taking sometimes. By the way, when you're in the interview, let me talk about something, because sometimes you are going to go in directions you're not expecting. Always say yes if they say, you don't want to hear this. And George LaCourse told the story one day, and I asked him, what did he do on weekends in the CCC? And I thought I knew the answer. Because usually on the weekends, the CCC guys that were working for the government would be taken to a small town and they could enjoy themselves, go to the movies or something. So I asked him, I said, what did you do on weekends? Pretty much expecting him to say what everybody else said. And he did. And then he went, oh, wait a minute, you're from Quincy, Florida, aren't you? He said, I went to Quincy one of the weekends. And I went, wow. And then he got kind of funny and he said, oh, you don't want to hear about that? And I said, oh, no, I do. Go ahead. I won't go into the details, but he described actually seeing in 1935 a lynching. In fact, a lynching that where I'm standing right now, I'm in Quincy, Florida, about 2.5 blocks away from my house right this second. He described a lynching. And you know, he got very emotional. We had to turn the tape off. He was actually a Greek immigrant. So not only just the trauma of seeing a human being, and it was, you know, I mean, it was, you know, as bad as you've read, naked, castrated, killed, drugged behind a truck. I mean, just every detail you can imagine that you've read about. So there's that pain and emotion. But he also was kind of back in 1935 because he, as an immigrants were lynched, especially where he was from, near Tampa. There were actually several immigrants lynched near Tampa in the 30s. And so he was scared at the time, and in retelling it, he got scared. And that was one of the most powerful things. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, part of me was, I was tearing up. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. There's that other part of me that was going, oh my God, I can't believe I'm getting this story. But I always remember I touched his knee and just said, we turned the tape recorder off, and I said, are you okay? And I remember when I touched his knee, I realized in that second, this is 2002, so this is, you know, almost 70 years after the fact, but I was 1 degree away from a lynching. Now again, you're rarely ever going to get a story like that. Not that you want stories like that all the time anyway, but you never know where the interview might go. And be prepared for that. And sometimes it might go too far where you really don't want to go there. You might want to go back. But be open. That gets back to listening as well. Anyway. So one of the things people always say, like, what do I transcribe? What do I not? You know. So one thing to keep in mind, you don't need to transcribe absolutely everything. So if you don't need to transcribe that. False starts. I do this all the time. You start talking. I mean, if you're 20 words into a sentence and then you stop and start again, yeah. But if you're just going, like, sort of, I got it. You don't need all that. You know, that's just silly. You make ohs or ums or even repetitive words like, you know. Sometimes you might record them at first and then you just skip them because that's not important, number one. 2, it does make the person sound ridiculous on paper. You don't want to transcribe phonetic accents. Now, if they say y'all, like I do all the time, hey y'all, yeah, transcribe that. But you don't need to say, you know, if he says, I just remember one of my colleagues, when we used to do interviews, his question was he always asked the same question. What would make you a good fit here at Bainbridge? And I always remember because no one ever knew what he was saying. What he was saying was fit, F-I-T, but he always said it like with a Y, fit. Now, if I was transcribing his interview, I would not write F-Y-E-T. I would write F-I-T, even though he does have an accent. I might at the beginning say the person speaks with a strong Southern accent or something. Maybe, but I won't phonetically create that accent, right? But also, you know, burps or sneezes, things like that. You just don't need all of that. However, I say, you know, the false starts or pauses when significant. Let me give you an example. I would never actually ask this, right? But let's say I ask, have you ever murdered anybody? That might be a significant pause, right? or you ever cheat on your wife? Again, never ask that, but let's say I did. Hold on. That might be significant, right? But most of the time it isn't. So there's no need to do that. You can also edit yourself a little bit. One of my tricks, and I've done it even in this talk, is I'll tell a story about myself to try to get a response from the person. Sometimes in the transcription, I might cut that down a little bit. I'm not going to lie, that's probably I'm probably edging towards maybe doing a little too much self-editing. We still have the tape, but again, I'm not the focus of the interview, the person is. So I'm not going to change the question to make it sound like they said something different, but I might shorten the question. If I'm kind of rambling when I'm asking the question, I might tighten it up, because again, the important part is the answer a little bit. You can use brackets, and sometimes you do. This is also where note-taking comes in handy. You don't want to do this too much, but a good example is somebody might say, all right, I caught a fish, it was about that big. And so what you should do, first off, is you should say, so you are holding your hands about 1.5 feet apart, right? Okay. But also in your notes, you might put held hand held his hands 2 feet apart. So things like that. Again, with the lynching story, I mean, he did break down and cry, and I did get in detail, but I said he became emotional. Tape recorder was turned off and then turned back on, that kind of thing. Again, if somebody is getting really emotional or angry or did you ever do this? Hell no, I didn't do that. Oh, hey, that might be significant that it wasn't just an answer, it was a forceful answer. So again, it's always kind of up to the transcriber, and sometimes if it's different from the interviewer, you might have a conversation about that sometimes. Again, ultimately, if you're trying to be accurate, like I said, when the tape recorder stopped, you need to note that. But ultimately, it's to convey the information as accurately and efficiently as possible. Again, let the person read over it, correct it, but not too much. And that's kind of going to be up to you as to what is too much. So what are we actually preserving in the long run? So obviously, all the formats of the interview, whether it's audio tape or CD or nowadays probably some kind of MP3 recording, but also you might turn that MP3 into a CD or something like, save all of it. The transcript, and that is the key part there. All releases, but also any and all correspondence, including, as I said at the beginning, any notes you might take from a phone interview. Some of that is you just want to be accurate. As an archivist, you want to keep everything. But a lot of that CYA as well. Because the person might say, hey, I didn't know he was going to ask me about no lynching. He didn't say he was going to talk about lynchings, and I should have, whatever. You want to, that will almost never happen. In fact, most of the time when you have any problems is if you're going to be interviewing somebody in power, a politician, president of a college maybe, somebody that is now going, oh, is this going to hurt my career? 99% of the people you interview will never have a problem, other than maybe just not liking how they sound. But that does cover you a little bit so that you're upfront about what you said, what they agreed to. And by the way, if you did violate what you said, there is a record of that for them as well. All the notes I take, I keep. I usually have a folder for the interview, so everything I brought with me, I keep. All the things I wrote down, all that stuff, I keep all of it. And if I take photographs, I always keep them. Every so often, they might even give you a copy of a photograph. Here am I when I was in the CCC. Here's me in the Marines. Try not to take their originals unless they really, really, really don't want them. Try to just get a copy because, but that would be helpful. But I do recommend, if you can, I forget sometimes, take a photo. And I usually get one of them, but I'll sometimes will get like a selfie or something of the two of us, just for me. Because sometimes it is nice to just know what they look like. And that also kind of, so you don't have to get into that awkward thing of always describing them. You have a photograph. So it's like, oh, there's their race, their gender, what they look like, all that, Again, really that's it. I could keep going, but I think that you got some sense of what to do. If you're really interested, if you need more, I know Dr. Melly can help you, of course. She's done this herself, but I'm always open to questions about interviews. You don't want to interview me. And hopefully, for those at ABAC that will be here in the future, we do hope to eventually get the Wiregrass Oral History Program back up and running. And we're going to do it down at Bainbridge, but also do it up in Tifton and maybe in Moultrie and Blakely and other places. So if you're interested in that, keep your eye open and maybe we can do some projects together. Alrighty, guys. Thank you very much. And I hope that was helpful. Thanks, guys.